Scotty. And now, before giving you the details of the battle, I bring you a warning. Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world, tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking.
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today I want to say a few thank yous to a lot of people who've been very supportive and have made the last 6 months of making this podcast very much fun. On top of that, the podcast has won an award, but you can learn more about that later. First of all, the show. We are now finally into the 1950s, which is considered the golden era of science fiction cinema. Now, the golden era of science fiction started a little bit earlier in the 1930s and 40s as pulps, magazines, and paperback books started to thrive. The film we're dealing with today, which is The Thing from Another World from 1951, is a case in point. This film was based on the 1938 story by John W. Campbell, Who Goes There? Campbell was not just a science fiction writer, but in 1937 became editor of Astounding Science Fiction. That magazine went on to become very central, along with Campbell, to the whole golden era of science fiction. In fact, all of the so-called Big Three have had some kind of roots in that magazine. So Robert Heinlein's first ever published story, Lifeline, as well as Arthur C. Clarke's first paid published story, Loophole, and Isaac Asimov's famous Foundation series all began in that magazine. To put things into perspective, the highest-grossing film of 1950 was Samson and Delilah. Two of my favourite films that are not science fiction are also from that year, All About Eve and Sunset Boulevard. But let's move on to The Thing from Another World. And to join us to face this beast, we have two heroes. First up, Jay Telotte is Professor Emeritus of Film and Media Studies at Georgia Tech. He has written/edited a ridiculous number of books and articles. How are you doing, Jay?
I'm fine. Nice to see you, Yisha.
Joining Jay is Mark Longenecker, who is Associate Professor of the Practice of Film Studies at Wesleyan University. How are you doing, Mark?
Doing great. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. Jay, I want to start with you. Because although you were very young when the 1950s began, you did actually live through it. And
I did.
There was a huge, huge science fiction explosion, I think is the only way we can describe it, which is quite unprecedented. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I mean, there really is little more than a handful of films that we could label, in retrospect, science fiction in the 1940s. And the war years have an awful lot to do with that. Science and technology were contributors, just as they were in World War I, to mass slaughter. And so seeing science and technology in a different light in that post-war period, it took a while, but it comes very rapidly once we get to 1949, 1950. 1949 is when we see the first American science fiction television show, Captain Video, and we're going to have indeed an explosion of science fiction television. We're going to have 4 TV series, and they're on all the major networks by the time a film like The Thing appears. We're going to have more than 500 science fiction films being released in the 1950s. We're going to have at least 3 films that make an appearance before The Thing, all of them very, very low-budget films, and 2 of them do very well, surprisingly, given their low budgets. And that's part of what starts the ball rolling for the rest of the decade, when we're going to have well more than 500 science fiction films released.
And which are the 2 there? Is that Destination Moon and Rocket Ship XM?
Exactly. And Destination Moon is they're both independent productions, but Destination Moon is a much more ambitious effort. Rocket Ship XM makes no pretensions to ambition. In fact, it's rushed out so that it can take advantage of the publicity going on for Destination Moon.
This is all preceded by the kind of boom in literary science fiction, right?
Pulp fiction, where a good bit of science fiction had been, and which, of course, is going to give us the impetus for The Thing through John W. Campbell's Who Goes There novella. It's big through 30s, 40s, into the 50s, but it's being pushed even harder by, that is the impetus for science fiction, pushed even harder by the nascent paperback publishing industry. And then when the paperbacks, which, by the way, are using some of the same strategies as the pulp fiction, that is very elaborate, lurid, colorful covers to attract people in newsstands, it's going to be followed by some of the early specialized hardcover publishers who are going to get into the science fiction market. So there's a developing market for science fiction, but it's not one that, at least initially, the major studios in the U.S. are going to rush to fill.
They were a little hush-hush, I think, is the word used about The Thing from Another World being science fiction.
And that is the term that's used in an interview that Hedda Hopper, the noted, and I'm reaching for a term to describe her place in the film industry. She was an ex-actress who did gossip columns, and that's the term that she used. That they weren't giving her enough information, that they were being very hush-hush. And indeed, RKO, which is the distributor of the film, they were extremely hush-hush about it up until a few weeks before it appeared, at which time they decided that they were going to do an exploitation push. They described it as an exploitation package that would include not just The Thing, but would include a couple of other films. They had two other films with equally, well, one was a mysterious title. It was Tokyo File 212, which has sunk without a trace. I can't find anything on that film. And the other was Jungle Headhunters. It was part of an exploitation package next to Jungle Headhunters. That sends a strange message to the theater owners. And what we need to keep in mind is that this is the point at which the film industry was radically changing its face. This is the point at which they have had to divest themselves because of the Supreme Court's what was called paramount decision. So they were having to divest themselves of the one of their major sources of profitability, which is the theaters themselves. So they could no longer own the theaters. That means they now had to not only sell to audiences. If you're RK, you're not only having to reach out to audiences, you're having to reach out to theater owners. And they're not sure that the theater owners are going to buy into science fiction. They do know that the theater owners, at least some of them, will be interested in something called, broadly, exploitation. And they actually hire a special new exploiteer, as he was called, a fellow named Terry Turner, to run the campaign. But up until the point when they bring him on, it is very much a hush-hush film, referred to as an adventure film, a mystery, or as a variety. I think it was a Variety headline labeled it when it was giving a list of upcoming films, and it said RKO will have Mellers, and as melodramas. And so this was broadly cast as a melodrama. None of the pre-premiere literature used the term science fiction.
This is all despite the fact that it had one of the most famous directors as a producer and potentially as a director. Mark, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, picking up off of Jay's point, one of the things to remember at this point in time is that controlling interest in RKO had recently been acquired by Howard Hughes, who was in the process of sort of running it into the ground a fair bit. And in fact, as Jay pointed out, Hughes via RKO was one of the first to kind of divest RKO of its theaters, whereas some of the other majors were fighting on a little longer. Hughes had worked and respected Howard Hawks. They had a kind of respect/contentious relationship. Both of them needed money at this point in time. Hughes needed a big success for RKO. Hawks just needed some money for himself. And so Hawks, his production company, Winchester Pictures, was signed by Hughes at RKO for a 3-picture deal, with the understanding that Hawks would produce 3 of those pictures through that banner and direct at least 2 of them. Hawks, for his first assignment, went through a couple things. He was trying to get a Western going, which he wasn't able to do till later. He was supposedly trying to make a drag version of Cinderella. And then apparently spurred by a magazine article he happened to pick up, he decided to go with Who Goes There, and which ultimately became The Thing.
Which the rights he bought for apparently $1,250, which apparently wasn't that much at the time, which I thought might have been, but no.
No. And so it was reasonably inexpensive to acquire. And, Hawks would move from not only one studio to another, but one kind of story form, generic type tone or whatever to another. And so he did tend to operate on a whim a bit. I mean, he had a very improvisational writing process and directing process. So it seems he had a very improvisational producing process to a certain degree as well.
So before we get too deep into Hawks, who I do genuinely adore, let's just point out that this film is officially directed by Christian Nyby.
Yes.
But the controversy is around the fact that a lot of people heavily believe that it's not Nyby who directed the film.
Correct. Yeah. So this is what we kind of call the "if it walks like a duck" theory of authorship in cinema. The way it goes, Hawks was trying to keep this inexpensive so that they could make via exploitation more money in the end. And he also sort of knew that there was a vague stigma with sci-fi. I mean, this wasn't yet the era of the kind of full prestige science fiction picture. So the money really went into the writers. And into his producing salary. And in fact, and so he sort of kept things cheap by hiring Christian Nyby, who had been his editor on several pictures, to be the director and to help him get a DGA card. Although I will point out that Hawks still took 88% of the director's salary, leaving Nyby with a credit and a little bit of money. And so the kind of the debate over time is, did Howard Hawks actually direct this picture, or is it just Christian Nyby, who had been working with Hawks for ages, who is essentially studying directing under Hawks, and then kind of Hawks as the producer, the one who controlled the purse strings and the final decisions, who helped to prepare the script, who helped to line up really everything else. Was he a director in all but name? And it is kind of depends on who you ask when. I mean, some of the actors will say, oh, no, Howard Hawks directed that. Others say, well, Nyby did, but Hawks was just sort of always there, and Nyby would check with Hawks about everything. Nyby himself says, look, I've been studying Howard Hawks. I've been cutting his films together, so obviously I'm going to have an influence there. And there is a tradition in the studio era of kind of producers taking kind of predominant creative control over their films. So it would seem that Hawks followed in that line. He certainly didn't totally take a back seat. He would, he would consult with Nyby. And I guess the big debate is how heavily he consulted.
It was Kenneth Tobey who played the main character, who I believe said that Hawks directed it all except one scene. I don't think he clarified which scene it was.
Yeah.
Whereas the Thing, James Arness insisted that it was Nyby who directed it. So there's a mixture of rumors and statements from different people about the whole situation. But I think what you were saying about walks like a duck, we'll get back to that. Actually, let you finish your point, and then we'll go back to the walks like a hawk situation.
It's to your point, but actually, even those two examples you mentioned, very interesting. James Arness playing the Thing, he's going to be in a lot of the effects shots, things like that. So, maybe he's working more with Nyby and the kind of technical team, whereas Kenneth Tobey is in all of these character scenes with overlapping action, with this kind of Hawksian or sort of overlap dialogue, semi-improvised at times, part of Hawks's stamp directing actors. So you can see how even among the acting team, that there's some disagreement or debate, maybe just within their individual experiences. I think that, the fundamental point is that this was Hawks's project from pre-production. He worked with his favored, his favors writer here, Charles Lederer, and an uncredited Ben Hecht. They hung out at Hawks's ranch and prepared the whole script. And then all of the other kind of, production decisions are touching on Howard Hawks in some way.
And I think the other thing is that Christian Nyby didn't go on to become kind of a really well-known director after that. Whereas let's go to the Hawksian themes. So if it walks like a hawk, Jay, do you want to start off with those, and maybe you can both?
I can certainly start us off. This is without a doubt has the Hawksian fingerprints all over it. Fast pace. It's one of the things about any Hawks film. It's going to move. The focus on a group, the focus on professionals and what the professionals can do that the amateurs or those who are not quite as adept are going to fail to do or fail to see. The dialogue, of course, the writers here have an awful lot to do with that dialogue. However, and this goes back to the notion of authorship, Ken Tobey and several others talk about how they would come in and Hawks would come up to them and say, "Here's your new dialogue." Or he would stop in the middle of a scene and say, "Try this." And he would give them something new to say. And that's why someone like Tobey says, well, it was all directed by Hawks. Because, again, it's that personal experience that Mark is talking about. But we know that he was intimately involved in the dialogue and the emending of that dialogue as it went along. The strong woman.
Now, wait a minute. We had a lot of fun when you were up here. And then when you asked me down to Anchorage, you deliberately fed me a lot of...
Tell me something. Did you really drink all those drinks?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't throw any away or anything? Not a one?
No.
Holy cat.
The Hawksian woman, which I had never heard of before. And I absolutely love Howard Hawks films, and really often because of this Hawksian woman, which I didn't know had a name. I love His Girl Friday, which has got Rosalind Russell, Ball of Fire with Barbara Stanwyck. We've got Katharine Hepburn in Bring Up Baby. And then in this one, Margaret Sheridan maybe isn't as Hawksian, but she definitely bears the hallmarks of being that kind of, has agency, has her own opinion on things, and isn't a pushover, isn't a wallflower. And it's just really enjoyable to watch that, especially, I think, when I've been watching so many films from the 1920s and 30s where you have such stereotypes of the wallflower that it's a really refreshing kind of character stereotype that Hawks has come up with.
And she can drink Ken Tobey under the table.
Mm-hmm.
Which he doesn't like.
Even in this, which is sort of like, I think, a comparatively minor expression of, the Hawks woman, you see the imprint here because you've got this little comedy scene between her and, Kenneth Tobey, which is very much in keeping with the kind of Hawks's comic approach to relationships, that the Hawks woman in comedies can be sort of destructive or at least kind of taking control, quote, emasculating, although I think that's a kind of careless term for it, but she's got his hands tied up, and they're debating and everything. But the fact is that she's integrated into the group along with the rest of them, and so much of the story of this movie, and is kind of the central story of Hawks's dramas and action movies, which is kind of who has the good sense to collectively join in the group and understand the kind of rituals and purposes and methods of the group in terms of solving the problem that's facing them. And even though she's initially on the scientist side, through her not just through her love interest, but through her competence, she sort of joins the military men in defeating the Thing, as opposed to the kind of misguided approach of the Dr. Carrington, the crazy scientist. It's a version of what you see in something more like, say, Only Angels Have Wings, or some of these other Hawks movies, or like Rio Bravo or something like that. Very often the female character's arc is, how do I understand this man through the lens of his professionalism? Whereas that's sort of less, kind of less part of this movie. But there's still recognizable notes of the Hawks woman in this.
And also, when they say, well, what do you do with like a vegetable? She's the one who's like, well, you cook it. I mean, it's a typical thing. Oh, the woman would know how to deal with a vegetable. But it's, she comes up with a solution of how to deal with this thing. Right.
The other point that we should underscore is one that Mark brings in, and that is the remarkably mixed tone that Hawks films have. That is, they can easily glide between high adventure and danger and comedy. In fact, you'll not find a Hawks film that doesn't have comic scenes mixed in. Mm. And part of that is the professional cohesion, the ability of these people to all come together and understand each other. And therefore, even in the direst of circumstances, they have the ability to make jokes, or to simply allow themselves to become jokes, as in I Was a Male War Bride.
Let's move on to the themes that are present in. This is made in 1951. It's the first film we're tackling from the 1950s, which is about to, bring, over 500 films, did you say, Jay?
Yes, I did. Well over 500.
Yeah. Okay, so the general themes, which I imagine we'll talk about quite often, but we just want to talk about the ones that affect this film. So we've got the atomic bomb, which is represented with the kind of Geiger detection, which leads them to the alien. And then you mentioned that bikini was mentioned. They talk about a man from bikini. Jay, so can you tell us a bit about that? Because that completely flew by me. I just did not notice it at all.
Oh, and it's one of the, again, a sort of a Hawksian hallmark. And as you use shorthand, you evoke knowledge that your audience has. And if you're trying to identify Dr. Carrington, you simply have a character say, oh, and then Dr. Carrington's not there. And another character will then say, oh, yeah, the fellow from Bikini. And that means he was there at the Bikini Atoll atomic testing that was going on. So this helps to establish the atomic theme, or one of the many themes of this film. But I think that's all part of the larger Cold War issue here. That this is pointedly a Cold War film that's going to evoke a number of different elements surrounding the Cold War. The story, Who Goes There, it changes basically four elements. The film changed basically four elements from that story. The nature of the monster, which we could come back to at some point. Putting Nikki in here. There are no women in the original story. There are no military in the original story. And the original story is set in the Antarctic. It's simply an Antarctic research base. This is set in the Arctic. Now, why that particular shift? Well, because there's a lot more talk in the 1950s about the Russians coming over the North Pole to bomb Canada and the U.S. And we had just established something called the DEW line. The DEW line is part of the NORAD system, and the NORAD system was a North American radar and air defense system. And we had these enormous radar installations and anti-aircraft stations, missiles, and air bases that were being built in Canada and the Western U.S. We were militarizing that particular part of the world, and so that militarization gives reason to having the Air Force, and of course, Hawks liked the military, and he much liked the new notion of an Air Force. There was no Air Force before 1947. Before that, it was all Army. And so this is a newly established arm. And by the way, Hawks had done a movie called Air Force in 1943. So here's someone who is very invested in the military, very appreciative of that whole tradition. That evocation, without ever saying we're defending the country, he has that evocation. He has the atomic bomb evocation. He has references to the Russians. He says the Russians, they're nosing all around up here. I believe that's what Captain Hendry says at one point.
Yeah, that says quite early in the start.
But he also says that we have a question about whether this massive pile of metal could be a Russian plane. But we're told they don't have anything that large. So we're evoking this whole world of the Cold War. And of course, it is a very cold place, fitting for a Cold War.
Yeah, good point.
So I think that's one of the main things we need to keep in mind. That he's addressing an audience that is worried, troubled, anxious about what's going on in the world. And in the best tradition of genre films, he's going to help them work that out. And he's going to help them work that out by allowing them to see what the American military, not their leaders, but the individuals, the good professionals like Hendry and his crew can do to help keep them safe.
I just wanted to mention that there was just a few years earlier. So 1947 is when the Roswell incident happened. And in 1947, so Roswell incident is there was a bunch of debris left in New Mexico, and a lot of people claim to have seen an unidentified flying object. And in 1947, in the same year, there were over 800 sightings of potential flying saucers and flying discs. So that craze had happened in 1947. So when this was being made, 1950, 1951, that would have been in the kind of awareness of the people of America at the time. And Jay, although you're talking about the army, it is much more of an individualistic thing. So although these are army men, it doesn't show them kind of obeying army orders.
It emphasizes the extent to which sometimes it's impossible to obey orders for whatever reason. One of the things that I think is interesting here is the way in which the extremes are set up in the same way, and that is the General Fogarty character at the beginning of the film has one catchphrase that he keeps using, and it's one that, in typical Hawksian fashion, is quite natural. He keeps saying, "Shut the door, shut the door." At one point, he says, "Do you think I could get the Pentagon to okay a revolving door here?" But it's the phrase he uses, I think, 3 times in the course of the second scene in the film. When we see Dr. Carrington, who has his own special knowledge, he's noticed that these various fungi had been wilted by tremendous blasts of cold. He grabs his closest Confederates and tells them to shut the door. The people who shut out others don't come off all that well. So Hendry is only right when he not only doesn't hear orders or can't get them, but when he doesn't follow them, and even says, "Well, court-martial me then." So this is one of the ways of underscoring his strength of character and the right-headedness that he displays.
Going back to the way that Hawks makes his imprint on the genre film, I mean, one of the things that he's very skilled about is he makes movies that are somehow both uniquely Hawksian movies and also kind of like foundational, right down the middle genre pieces. And so a lot of kind of what you're seeing here is some of kind of recurring sort of Hawksian attitudes mapped onto the science fiction film. Something else that Jay pointed out that I think is very shrewd is Hawksian shorthand, and this is part of the reason he makes such good genre movies. As you noted, we've already had kind of the UFO craze in America, so you can kind of just cite a UFO, you can have people stand in a circle and see that they're standing in a circle and trust that the audience makes a connection between that image and the UFO, carrying yourself into, a science fiction film here. He is not by nature a kind of preachy person. He's got sort of the same message, which is like, are you good enough to execute your job? Do you understand the nature of the job correctly? And that's also how he distinguishes the characters, right? Dr. Carrington he's sort of like enamored with the biological systems of the giant evil carrot, making a few comments specifically in praise of its non-sexual reproduction.
Seed pod.
Seed pod? Yes, the neat and unconfused reproductive technique of vegetation. No pain or pleasure, as we know. No emotions. No heart. Our superior in every way.
I mean, this sort of affects, if you're thinking about how this is going to affect the viewer and make them sort of stop liking Dr. Carrington, this works in a couple ways. One is that we've just had some of these lovely scenes of warm-blooded flirtation between the captain and his love interest. So we like warm-blooded flirtation. We don't like a doctor who doesn't like sex. And then the other thing is there is something, that you start to see in American movies and this metaphor of outer space invaders connected to the metaphor of communist invaders, which is, there's something un-American about them, that this sort of this over-intellectualized approach to like a political system, a government system, a sort of a lack of individuality, an insistence on conformity, the sort of like, giving away your sort of independent thought and problem solving. The doctor's, slavish devotion to science is sort of like an ideologue's devotion to communism, right? So much of Hawks's visual presentation of kind of the primary affinity group tends to be a sort of a group medium shot that includes you as kind of the other side of the circle. Like think about that card game at the beginning, or all the shots on the plane, or any of the conversations among characters. Hawks is kind of treating the camera and you by extension as part of this collective group of professionals. And he really makes a point about keeping Carrington at kind of a distance. Like he's very emotionally cold. You have some reason to kind of question him and not understand him. And in kind of good Hawksian shorthand, he understands that we've seen, a plethora of mad scientist movies. We've seen Frankenstein. We've seen all these other things that draw from that archetype. And so he doesn't have to do much to get you to understand Carrington, and that archetype that, science above all. And, there's something funny here too. Every time Carrington starts a speech, he seems to kind of get cut off till by the end of the movie, like Kenneth Tobey is just like, get him out of here. Make him stop making speeches. The immediacy of the situation, in the sense that there's a bunch of people in harm's way who are attempting to accomplish the goal of saving themselves and by extension humanity from this monster, and his interference in it takes it away from the sort of purely metaphorical symbolic and actually puts it into a kind of like action melodrama context.
So I wanted to go to Jay just to ask him a little bit more about comparing it to The Day the Earth Stood Still. So Jay, can you compare the two films?
Well, Isha, I am not an enormous fan of The Day the Earth Stood Still. The very title announces its sort of portentousness, its importance. in a way that something like The Thing or The Thing from Another World in no way does. The Thing is simply much more natural in its characterizations, in the way in which its characters interact, in the way in which they react to and interact with that extreme environment. But this reminds us of something fundamental here, and that is the American cinema is having to work out how it does science fiction. It's trying not to, I think, pointedly, trying not to do what science fiction on television is doing. It's certainly not trying to be like the Pulp Fiction. Can it, that is science fiction, deal with important concerns, such as world peace in the case of Day the Earth Stood Still? Or can it tell basic human stories? And I think we wind up with, for all of its exploitative possibilities, The Thing does deal with basic human emotions, human concerns, and concerns that are quite natural given the anxieties of that period, whether they're the observable anxieties of atomic testing, and saber rattling between East and West, or whether they're the almost mythic level, as in flying saucers. And what this film does is it manages to work those out.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I wanted to move on to the fact that when this film was made, apparently it was quite scary and it would have been really terrifying for kids. I just wanted to read out someone we will talk about right now, which is John Carpenter, as he made the remake in 1982, which was much more true to the original source material. So he said, "It was 1952 and I would have been about 4 or 5 years old. I think it was in a re-release. It was one of those films where, as you watched it, it was so frightening that my popcorn flew out of my hands. In other words, when they went up to the doorway and they had this Geiger counter and they opened the door and he's right there, I went nuts. I went crazy." And then John Carpenter went on to make the remake in 1982. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
In the original story, the monster is a shapeshifter. In the Hawks version, it's sort of a kind of vegetable Frankenstein. And note how the Hawks version, it's very shrewd about the images you get to see. You don't see the two scientists bleeding, hung upside down. Instead, you get an analog for it in the 2 bags of blood feeding the little seed pods. And as Carpenter pointed out, Hawks is very good about kind of playing with the rhythm. They go up to the door and they open the door and you don't get a beat. You just get the monster there. Or think about the scene. I was really struck by the very effective immediacy of the monster coming through the door when they throw kerosene on him and light him on fire. I mean, that's one of the earliest full body fire suit stunts. And it's they're really throwing flammable liquid and setting someone on fire. It has a striking and, might I say, very Hawksian immediacy and integrity of action to it. With the other sort of aspect of why Hawks doesn't kind of use the original story's premise is because, for kind of Hawks, it's, he's making movies about the triumph of professionals coming together to stop a threat. And the germ of the central story is about this sort of mistrust of a shapeshifter who may be assuming a form of someone you don't know. And that's what Carpenter pulls from to make his 1982 version of The Thing, with Kurt Russell and Keith David and other people. Carpenter has a number of things at his disposal. He has better special effects, and really something that the 1982 Thing is remembered for is the kind of grotesque and impressive practical special effects that show the monster in various forms of transformation. And so, that kind of startling, really, gruesome, effects thing. And the implicit suggestion of this might be inside someone who otherwise looks like your colleague, your coworker. That is the root of all of this distrust within the movie.
It is interesting because I think that distrust element is so interesting.
Yeah.
And it could have been used, especially in the kind of Cold War kind of context, but it's not very Hawksian, because Hawksian is about solving problems, not about kind of mistrusting, your fellow good guys who are kind of part of that team.
Yeah, in Hawks movies, you can usually spot the person who doesn't belong. Hawks movies are very often about, especially the kind of the more dramatically, skewed ones, the more problem-solving action melodrama type ones. They're very much about who's in the in group and who's in the out group. And we talked some about how Hawks signals to us that Dr. Carrington does not really belong in the in group there, or even something like the lapse in professionalism of the soldier that puts the blanket over the thing and melts the thing. This is something Hawks does a lot. The guy who's a little sort of too weak or sort of not good enough and almost derails the whole thing. There's an equivalent in Red River where there's a guy who keeps stealing sugar from the pantry and then causes a cattle stampede. That's essentially the Western equivalent of that. The type of, like you were saying, kind of Cold War era mistrust. 1982, unfortunately, still Cold War era. But if you're talking about that sort of height, 50s, 60s thing, now we're talking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You know what I mean? So we're talking about, it's just a different way of using sci-fi ideas to kind of deal with, sort of American social concerns or Western social concerns, and finding a different science fiction metaphor and a different monster metaphor that fits that.
Absolutely. Jay, did you have anything to add about the remake?
Well, a number of years ago, Aisha, I did an article for Film Quarterly in which I began with a commentary on the Carpenter, The Thing. This is when it first came out. And I was especially intrigued by the way in which it ended up with a rather curious comment from the MacReady character, in which he says, as he's facing the lone other survivor of the aliens' predations, he says, "I know I'm human." And of course, taken out of context, it seems like a totally irrelevant remark. In the context, it reminds us of how much of this film is about our humanity, and that is the strongest point of the remake of The Thing. This is one of those films that I think helped shift the science fiction film into a different register, to take on in the strongest way a whole different concern for science fiction than we were finding in the renewed space opera of the Star Wars ilk, and it's furthered by other films of almost exactly the same time. Blade Runner, for example, 1982. Android, 1982. Strange Invaders, 1983. Starman, 1984, Terminator, 1984, Daryl, 1985, and many, many others. And as they're all interrogating our humanity, what does it mean to be human? How do we know we're human? Do we do certain things that identify us in the best possible way as human? And they do it with robots, with androids, with cyborgs, with replicants, with shapeshifters. And these are all films about the problematic nature of the human being and the increasingly difficult task of being human in the modern world. And that's where I think, this film really finds its niche. It is one of the earlier films to pushes the entire science fiction genre in a new direction, one that becomes the dominant direction for a number of years.
Thank you so much for that, Jay. I wanted to talk about the other ways that this film has a legacy. And I was watching this I've spent a really long amount of time watching Alien 1979, and I just couldn't get over the similarities. One of the biggest similarities is the scientist. So you've got Ash in the original, who describes the alien as the perfect organism, and Dr. Carrington in The Thing from Another World saying our superior in every way. And aside from that, they've also got similar kind of Geiger counter devices to seek out the alien. And whilst they're doing that, both of them have a jump scare. In the original film, there's a dead dog. And in the new film, you have the very live cat that also serves as a jump scare. But Mark, are there any other kind of long-standing legacies that this film has put into cinema of science fiction?
Well, I mean, one of the things that you're touching on and you mentioned with regard to Carpenter is it inspires a generation of filmmakers who were affected by this film in their youth. So, certainly people like John Carpenter, Ridley Scott, for example. And you and I talked before that John Carpenter was a huge Howard Hawks fan, and that's evident throughout his work. You can take a monster or a science fiction problem and you can adapt it to fit the world of its day. Sometimes it's just taking something that is effective as a piece of storytelling, as a world to live in, and just polishing it up with the special effects of a new era, but there has to be something at the center that works. And so the nice thing about The Thing is that there isn't a ton of money in this thing, and yet the thing meaning the movie, and yet how do you effectively execute that? And if we take this thing from a vegetable into an acid-blooded alien that has all sorts of additional resonance with regard to sort of pregnancy and reproduction and things like that. Now we can kind of spin this off into another set of horror-inducing anxieties or science fiction thematic musings or what have you.
And Jay, what do you think is the legacy of this film?
That it continues to inspire other sequels or prequels is the most obvious part of that legacy, but it's also inspired others, and I think John Carpenter is the most obvious case. He includes 2 scenes from The Thing in Halloween. There are other homages using Ken Tobey in several of Joe Dante's films. I think The Howling, Gremlins, and maybe as another. Ken Tobey has to reprise his role in The Thing in a film called Attack of the B-Movie Monsters. And supposedly Carpenter is involved in preliminary work on a sequel to his version of The Thing. It also managed to effectively tap into something that was already a part of film and literary imaginations, and that is the isolated, threatened group, and a notion that goes far, far back in Western literature, and a sort of thread that we can follow from The Thing through period films such as Robot Monster, Target Earth, Day the World Ended, and many others throughout the 1950s. And again, I'll use that term archetypal. There was archetypal context that the Hawks managed to milk so well here, and demonstrated to others that this is something that you can build good narratives around, or reminded them that they could build good narratives around the isolated group, and how that isolation and the being threatened from outside brings cohesion. Brings people together, helps mold societies.
Excellent. Can we move on to what you would recommend to pair with this film, which is actually an idea my friend Laura Noble gave me when we were first discussing the podcast. So, Jay, what do you recommend?
Well, maybe the most obvious and just for fun is the song that had come out a few months before the film opened. Phil Harris's recording of The Thing. It was a novelty comic song, and that one that RKO feared would skew expectations for the film, and that is reputedly one of the reasons why they appended that "From Another World" as a subtitle that is put in microprint in all the original advertising. I would also point to the electronic music here and compare that to other science fiction films of the period that also employed it. This is the theremin that gave it that eerie sound, especially when we're first fixing the shape of this thing in the ice. But Rocket Ship XM had used it. The Day the Earth Stood Still would use it. And then there's that variation of electronic music in Forbidden Planet. So this is a reminder of new directions for music in the post-war period, and the way these new sounds readily keyed audiences to see films in a different context.
Mark, do you have a recommendation?
Yes. Well, I mean, again, the obvious thing is the 1982 John Carpenter The Thing, but there's a fun episode of the X-Files called Ice. I think it's season 1, episode 9, if I remember correctly. And it just shows something that series does, which is very often to take something that you had seen at the movies or on video and, put the central characters through it, sort of squeeze it into an hour form in your television world. And, that's a particularly fun early episode of the X-Files.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, both of you.
Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Next episode, we'll be talking about The Day the Earth Stood Still. So take a look at the show notes to find out where you can buy or rent that. The reason I wanted to do a big thank you is the podcast has won an award. And this is the closest thing I'm ever going to get to an Oscar. So here it goes. Thank you to Frank at Earworthy, who decided to listen to a whole bunch of podcasts and decide that this one was the one he was going to give the Best Film History Award for 2024 at Earworthy. Thank you, Frank. I want to thank Laura again for coming up with the pairing with the podcast film idea. Thank you, Laura. Thank you to Hans for giving me the courage to use sound bites again after the very first episode, my Pigs in Space soundbite went wrong. So thank you. Thank you to every single listener who has shared, listened, recommended, or given feedback, either on email or on social media. Thank you to you guys. And lastly, and very, very importantly, to all the brainiacs, the guests, for coming on to this show and sharing their knowledge and their enthusiasm. Thank you.